New allegations against Sean Diddy Combs, and these are some of the most horrific yet. A man says he was just 10 years old when the rapper allegedly drugged and sexually assaulted him during what was supposed to be an audition, sending him back to his parents crying and in pain. The latest lawsuits against the music mogul seem to reinforce previous claims made in both civil and criminal court, and we're going to break down these most recent allegations right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. On Monday, Texas attorney Tony Buzbee's law firm filed two new lawsuits in New York State Supreme Court, alleging that music superstar Sean Diddy Combs sexually assaulted two underage boys in the early 2000s, and one of them was allegedly just 10 years old at the time. As if these allegations couldn't get worse. Now, we've been closely following the legal drama that's been stalking Sean Combs, and right now, as we know, he's locked up in the Metropolitan Detention Center out in Brooklyn. He's been denied bond twice. His attorneys, though, they plan to try for a third time to get him out of lockup as he waits for trial. He's now going to be petitioning the new judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. And we actually just learned that when it comes to where he's locked up, multiple agencies are investigating the Metropolitan Detention Center, the MDC, maybe looking into the conditions, maybe doing a sweep of contraband in the area. We did actually a whole Sidebar episode dedicated to that because the circumstances in that facility are pretty horrific. And we were wondering whether or not Sean Combs and the notoriety of his case has facilitated or has led to this investigation. We talked about it. You can check it out on our Law&Crime YouTube channel. It should be up there right now. Now, as we get into these latest developments, I have to warn you. I have to give you a trigger warning here. These details are not only unimaginable, but they're horrifying. They're horrifying. They can be incredibly difficult to listen to. I got to tell you, I was reading these lawsuits and I even winced because it's so just disgusting. It's incredibly disturbing. But look, this is a legal case now. And it's important to understand what the victims are alleging, the legal basis for their claims, what evidence they may have to support their claims, and the impact that this could have on Sean Combs and, of course, his criminal case. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about it. Now, before we even get into the actual claims of this lawsuit, I have to give you a brief background about where we're at. So a grand jury in the Southern District of New York indicted Sean Combs on federal charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He was arrested on September 16th. He's been, as I said, behind bars ever since after being denied bail. And prosecutors say that Combs used his money, his influence, to organize what are called freak-offs. These are essentially orgies that involved hiring male sex workers, procuring drugs, and then filming these sex acts. That he used force, fraud, coercion, to get what he wanted, that he engaged in a campaign of sexual exploitation and abuse of women. By the way, what do I talk about all the time on Sidebar? I talk about the law, right? Shocker, law and crime. I talk about the law, but I also talk about legal rulings, legal decisions. And right now, I got a landmark one for you that has just changed things in a very big way because you can now legally trade on who will win the 2024 election. Yes, this is legal. And that's because our sponsor of Sidebar, Kalshi, went to court and won legal approval for election trading for the first time in over 100 years. So not only can you essentially bet on the 2024 presidential election winner, but with Kalshi, you can bet on who will control the House and Senate, who will win the swing states. You think it's pretty timely? What's happening next week? And it's not just politics, by the way. You can bet on other future events too, like will Taylor Swift win top artist on Spotify this year? What's going to be the Rotten Tomatoes score for upcoming movies like Gladiator 2? I actually think it's going to do really well. I think it's going to be above 85%, personally. That's what I think. But anyway, there's so much more. You're going to be like, wow, I can trade on that? This is the only place to trade on events like this in all 50 states. And right now, you can sign up using our link, kalshi.com/sidebar, or you can scan the QR code on screen. And if you're one of the first 500 traders who deposit $100, Kalshi will give you a free $20 credit. That's kalshi.com/sidebar. The fact that Combs now faces criminal charges in federal court, though, it hasn't stopped what has been an onslaught of civil cases against him. In fact, he is facing new allegations every single week. And we told you about Tony Buzbee, this Texas attorney, who announced that he was going to be filing more than 100 individual civil actions against Sean Combs. And he's been true to his word. I mean, so far, Busby and his partners have filed more than a dozen of these lawsuits, with many more seemingly looming on the horizon. Combs, though, he's always denied any wrongdoing. Let's be clear about that, both in federal court and in statements released by his attorneys in response to these new civil lawsuits. He's always maintained his innocence. In a statement, a representative for Combs said, Mr. Combs and his legal team have full confidence in the facts, their legal defenses, and the integrity of the judicial process. In court, the truth will prevail that Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted anyone, adult or minor, man or woman. And when it comes to Tony Busby, Sean Combs' team had this to say: the lawyer behind this lawsuit is interested in media attention rather than the truth, as is obvious from his constant press appearances and 1-800 number. As we've said before, Mr. Combs cannot respond to every new publicity stunt, even in response to claims that are facially ridiculous or demonstratively false. And it is important to note, while Combs has settled at least one lawsuit, like the bombshell lawsuit filed by his ex Cassandra Ventura nearly a year ago that started the whole ball rolling with this legal saga, he has not admitted any culpability. While he did apologize on Instagram after the 2016 video of him purportedly beating Cassandra Ventura at a hotel hallway surfaced by CNN. But other than that, look, to be clear, he hasn't been found liable in any court. He hasn't been found guilty of any wrongdoing in any court. So right now, he is presumed innocent. And these are allegations. They're serious allegations, but they're allegations. But having said that, what is being put out there now in the course of these new civil lawsuits is arguably even worse than what we've heard before. It's kind of hard to judge, but let me get into this, because on Monday, Tony Busby and his legal partners, they filed a suit against Combs on behalf of a Jane Doe who lives in California. The lawsuit states, this case seeks compensatory and punitive damages for the drugging and sexual assault of a 10-year-old boy when he met defendant Sean Combs for an audition. The conduct described herein is shockingly typical of how Combs conducted himself for many years. And look, that is true. Many of the allegations from Combs' accusers say they were drugged and then they were assaulted, that this is a pattern. And of course, we know when it comes to the federal charges, Combs is accused of using drugs to have people engage in those freak-off sessions. By the way, when we talk about compensatory damages, those are damages to really restore someone to whole where they were before the incident, and punitive damages are a way to punish the defendant. Okay, but back to the lawsuit. Combs isn't the only defendant named. In fact, this is very typical of a lot of the lawsuits we're seeing, because it's not just Combs, it's business entities. Because the plaintiff also alleges here misconduct by multiple companies that are associated with Sean Combs and his entertainment empire. This includes Combs Enterprises LLC, Bad Boy Entertainment LLC, there are more. The complaint reads, on the surface, each of these businesses served a legitimate purpose related to entertainment, music, and other subjects, but in reality, Combs, by and through himself and his agents, employees, and contractors, used these businesses to sexually assault, abuse, threaten, and coerce hundreds of individuals through sexual quid pro quo schemes, as well as to take advantage of individuals with impunity, thinking the victims would never seek recourse. Combs and his agents, employees, and contractors through these Combs businesses would tell victims, this is what it takes to be famous, what are you willing to do to become a star, and perform this sexual act or else, to coerce the victim into performing a non-consensual sexual act for the gratification of Combs and his cohorts. Now again, that is very consistent with the criminal racketeering charge that Combs faces, that he used his businesses to further illegal activities like sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson. But let's talk about the specific claims from this Jane Doe in this lawsuit. Again, trigger warning, very difficult to listen to, but it says, quote, in 2005, plaintiff was a 10-year-old boy interested in becoming an actor and or rapper. Plaintiff lived in the Los Angeles area and used his proximity to the entertainment industry to secure several acting roles and a part in a music video. To help their son's burgeoning career, plaintiff's parents found and hired an industry consultant through an internet ad. The consultant recommended that the family visit New York City to meet with people in the music industry. During the trip, plaintiff's consultant arranged a meeting with defendant Combs for a, quote, audition. Combs indicated that he wanted to meet with plaintiff alone first prior to meeting the family. The consultant, without plaintiff's parents, took plaintiff to the purported audition at a hotel in the same general vicinity as plaintiff's own hotel. The consultant brought plaintiff to Combs' room, but left him with Combs and told plaintiff that she would be back later. Plaintiff recalls other people in the room or area, but he did not know who any of the people were. So here's this claim that a consultant, I don't even know if the proper word is recruit, but facilitated this meeting between this boy and Sean Combs, seemingly convinced the parents that it was okay for him to go alone to meet one of the most famous men in the world at the time. And for anyone, of course, the allure of money and fame, that can be pretty mesmerizing, but especially, I would imagine, for a child. So keep that in mind, 10-year-old child here. The complaint says, quote, plaintiff performed several rap songs for Combs. Combs complimented plaintiff on his rapping and told plaintiff that he could make him a star. Combs asked plaintiff how badly he wanted to be a star and what plaintiff would do to get to be one. Plaintiff responded, as might any 10-year-old child, that he would do anything. So at this point, one of the other people present allegedly gave this boy a soda, and after he drank it, he started to feel, quote, a little funny, but he chalked it up to being maybe just so excited about his opportunity to rap for Sean Combs. But the plaintiff now believes that that soda was drugged with either GHB, known as the date rape drug, or ecstasy, or maybe even both. And that's interesting because, again, it's not Combs accused of giving a drug drink to an alleged victim. It's one of his employees or associates or friends, people who were involved in something that likely didn't appear to be above board and yet did it anyway. That person, although to be clear, is not named in the complaint. The complaint says, quote, after plaintiff consumed his soda and began feeling its effects, Combs told plaintiff to move closer to him, which plaintiff did. Combs then abruptly pushed plaintiff down and said words to the effect of, you have to do some stuff you don't want to do sometimes. Now, the next part of the complaint is just incredibly graphic. I'm not going to repeat it here, but essentially Jane Doe claims that Combs sexually assaulted him and then he lost consciousness. 10 years old. Quote, when plaintiff awoke, he began crying immediately. Plaintiff's pants were undone, and then he says that his private areas hurt badly. Combs was still present. Plaintiff cried that he wanted to go to his mom and dad. Combs replied that if plaintiff told anyone about what had happened, he would hurt plaintiff's mom and dad badly. Upon plaintiff's return, his parents immediately noticed that he was lethargic and acting differently. Although plaintiff ultimately told his parents what happened, plaintiff and his parents were terrified of the potential consequences of reporting the abuse. I want to focus on that point real quick because assuming these allegations are true, some might say, how could you not report this to the police? Your child gets attacked. I don't care who the person is. You go to the police. The other way of looking at it is, and this is a big theme that makes its way into these lawsuits and even the criminal case, is that Combs' power, his influence, his money, that scared people from coming forward. It was what led them to engage in these activities. The fear for their lives, their fear of reprisals. And look, that will ultimately be up to a judge or a jury to decide regarding the credibility of this Jane Doe if this should make its way to trial. But I just have to call that point out. Now, according to the complaint, Jane Doe has had serious behavioral and emotional issues since this alleged 2005 incident. He reportedly suffers from depression, panics easily, battles night terrors, and he's bringing his claim against Combs as part of the New York City Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Act. We've told you about this before. It's a law referenced by Combs' accusers, more specifically the Tony Busby clients. And what this law does is it allows an alleged victim of gender-motivated violence, where it doesn't just have to be sexual assault, by the way, it can be any kind of violence, a look-back window to file a lawsuit, even if their claims would otherwise be too old. Remember, this is in 2005. So now they have until February 2025 to file lawsuits. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing so many happen right now. According to the complaint, the requirement that the crime of violence be committed because of gender or on the basis of gender and due at least in part to an animus based on the victim's gender is satisfied because defendant Combs forced plaintiff to engage in a sexual interaction without consent. Plaintiff Jane Doe could not effectively consent because of his age. The non-consensual sexual touching of a minor herein presented a serious risk of physical injury and in fact caused such injury. Gender animus adheres when consent is absent. And the lawsuit reiterates that businesses connected to Combs could be at fault as well. It alleges the Combs businesses had knowledge and or should have had knowledge of Combs' widespread and well-known practice of committing sexual assault and gender-motivated violence, including on premises owned and or operated by defendants, and did nothing to stop it. And the plaintiff here is demanding a jury trial. Okay, so putting that horrifying lawsuit to the side, we have another one that we want to tell you about, because that is not the only man claiming that Sean Combs assaulted him in the early 2000s during the height of his career. Another California John Doe filed a suit on Monday as well. According to the filing, this case seeks compensatory and punitive damages for a violent sexual assault that occurred at a Making the Band audition in New York. Now, as many of you might recall, Making the Band was a very popular reality show on MTV where participants lived together, they competed to become part of a new singing group. The show created O-Town, Danity Kane, a group known as The Band. Being chosen to be part of the band at the end of the series, that could be life-changing. Do you remember the girl group Danity Kane? Not only they had record deals, they went on tour, but there was clothing and perfume lines. The lead singer, Aubrey O'Day, was featured on Visa debit cards at one point. So this, as you can imagine, is a huge opportunity for somebody like John Doe. His complaint says, in or around 2008, plaintiff, then 17 years old, participated in a 3-day audition for Making the Band, having seen the opportunity online and through newspaper advertisements. During the audition process, plaintiff advanced to a stage where contestants met individually in private rooms with Combs and his bodyguard. John Doe says that on the first day of the audition, he had a one-on-one interview with Combs, and Combs allegedly asked him hypothetical questions about how he would handle situations involving sexual pressure. The plaintiff says as Combs was talking to him, he started groping the then 17-year-old and allegedly told him to undress. And John Doe even claims that during all of this, Combs allegedly pleasured himself. And Combs reportedly emphasized that he could make or break John Doe's career. The second day featured a longer meeting. Quote, during this interview, Combs again instructed plaintiff to undress, explaining that plaintiff needed to demonstrate the ability to embody a sex idol persona, which was purportedly required for the band's image. This encounter eventually escalated into Combs forcing the plaintiff to perform oral sex on him and Combs sodomizing the plaintiff. And here's where a brand new allegation is made. According to John Doe, Combs' bodyguard, who's unnamed in the lawsuit, was not only present during the alleged sexual assault, but also participated in the sexual assault. Quote, plaintiff's facial expressions during this ordeal showed his discomfort and hesitation, prompting Combs to express dissatisfaction. Combs stated that plaintiff's demeanor suggested an intention to report the incidents, and as a result, Combs said he would be keeping an eye on plaintiff. Ultimately, this led to plaintiff's elimination from the competition, as Combs claimed that plaintiff was untrustworthy due to his reservations about performing oral sex on his bodyguard. As a result of these assaults during the audition process and plaintiff's reactions to them, plaintiff was excluded from further opportunities in the competition and was unable to return to the music industry for 7 years. And this John Doe is also demanding a jury trial. Now, one final note about these Tony Buzbee lawsuits. Aside from Sean Combs, mostly everyone else who either participated in or facilitated this alleged abuse, or allegedly did so, is not identified by name in these lawsuits. Not clear why. Could be maybe Tony Buzbee and the team don't know the identity of these people. Maybe they don't know the identity of the people yet. Perhaps they will be added as defendants. In fact, there's a line in the complaint that reads, plaintiff reserves the right to add as defendants any individuals, including but not limited to celebrities and business entities. Or is it possible that Tony Buzbee and his team know who these people are, particularly celebrities, as have been listed in other lawsuits, and maybe there is an effort to try to settle the claims with them so that they are not named in the lawsuits? Remember, he has indicated to TMZ that this is what might be happening, that people are reaching out to settle claims so they're not named. And as we've talked about before, you can look at this two ways. On one hand, you can make the argument, oh, everybody's coming out now for a money grab. Everybody's suing Sean Combs, especially after his indictment, because he's an easy target. The other way to look at it is, it had to take other people to sue him. It had to take for Sean Combs to be arrested, to be charged, to be locked up, for these accusers to finally feel safe to come out against him. We'll see where these suits shake up and what these allegations are, but we got to talk about this lawsuit. So it was filed last week by Texas-based attorney Tony Buzbee, who we've talked about before. He is an attorney who has vowed to bring forth hundreds of lawsuits against Sean Combs, that he would name names of people involved in these episodes of abuse, that he would go basically launch a legal war against Sean Combs and any businesses or entities or people that were involved in this. Now, in this specific lawsuit, there are allegations that Combs threatened to kill a teenager and her friend before sexually assaulting them. Let me lay it out. The claimant, who is filing as a Jane Doe, is suing the 54-year-old rapper for damages relating to what she says was an alleged 2004 incident when she was a 19-year-old college student in New York City. The Jane Doe says that she attended a photo shoot promoting Da Band. This was a singing group that was signed to Combs' label Bad Boy Records at the time. The event was taking place across the street from her college in Brooklyn, New York. She says she attended this event with a friend from college, that the two of them were invited to an after party, and before they could leave to go to the party, they encountered Sean Diddy Combs. The suit reads, quote, Combs told Miss Doe and her friend that they should come to his hotel for a more exclusive party. Miss Doe and her friend agreed and were taken to a Manhattan area Marriott hotel by a member of Combs' entourage. So she claims they get to the hotel, and supposedly there were about a dozen people drinking in this hotel suite, but then things take a very violent turn. She says she and her friend were grabbed by a security guard and taken to a separate room. She even claims that when she asked the guard where he was taking her, he said, quote, you know what you're here for. When they get to this separate room, which was apparently a bedroom, she says the security guard locked her and her friend inside, and there was only one other person in this room, Sean Combs. And that is where things get more troubling. The suit reads, Combs gave Miss Doe and her friends more drinks and then instructed them to imbibe cocaine that he prepared for use on the coffee table. Combs continued getting gradually more aggressive with the two women and eventually began to forcibly touch them without consent. The suit goes on to say that when these two women tried to resist these advances, Combs allegedly told them to engage in sexual activity with him or else. Quote, Combs ordered Miss Doe's friend to perform oral sex on him or else he would have them both killed. Miss Doe's friend complied as Miss Doe begged him to allow them to leave. He did not agree. He then allegedly ordered the Jane Doe to undress, quote, under the threat of violence, and began to sexually assault her. She was allegedly crying and begging for him to stop. So she's claiming that she's essentially being held hostage inside of this room during this terrifying ordeal as things just completely spiral out of control, but eventually there's a disruption. Quote, likely due to Miss Doe's cries, the door opened and the security guard from earlier came in to ask if everything was all right. Miss Doe's friend took the opportunity to rush out of the recently locked door. Miss Doe, however, could not move as he was still on top of her. Now, Combs allegedly eventually leaves the room to talk to the security guard, but he issues a warning to the young woman. Quote, he left the room but told Miss Doe to stay, otherwise she would be killed. So now we have two alleged death threats in this case. So how did this all shake out? Well, the lawsuit claims that this woman was only able to escape this situation when about a half hour later, a guard opens the door and told her she could leave. Now, legally, this unnamed plaintiff is claiming that Combs' alleged actions violate the New York City Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Act, arguing, quote, the requirement that the crime of violence be committed because of gender or on the basis of gender and due at least in part to an animus based on the victim's gender is satisfied because defendant Combs forced plaintiff to engage in sexual interaction without consent. We've talked about this statute before. This is a common law that Combs' accusers, including those who are represented by Tony Buzbee, they are filing their claims under. And it allows a victim of gender-motivated violence a look-back window to file a lawsuit, even if their claims would otherwise be too old. If otherwise, they would be time-barred. They would be time-barred by the statute of limitations, not under this. Because now you would have until February 2025 to file these kinds of lawsuits. It's one of the reasons that you're seeing so many of these lawsuits before that window closes. And by the way, when it comes to gender-motivated violence, that doesn't just have to be sexual assault. It could be any kind of violence that's motivated by gender. Now, Jane Doe is asking to be awarded compensatory damages for physical injuries, emotional distress, as well as for psychological harm, anxiety, humiliation, physical and emotional pain and suffering that would happen during a trial. And compensatory damages are a way to restore Jane Doe to the position that she would be in before this attack. She's also requested the court award her punitive damages, or a way to punish the defendant for really egregious conduct, and also attorney's fees and costs. This lawsuit is one of many that Sean Combs is facing right now. And even despite the allegations in these lawsuits, despite the criminal allegations that he's facing, he has always maintained his innocence. And in that vein, a representative for Sean Combs released this statement. Mr. Combs and his legal team have full confidence in the facts, their legal defenses, and the integrity of the judicial process. In court, the truth will prevail that Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted anyone, adult or minor, man or woman. And specific to this lawsuit, and maybe the Tony Buzbee lawsuits in general, a representative for Sean Combs issued a statement to Us Weekly. And these are the thoughts on Tony Buzbee. The statement reads, quote, "The lawyer behind this lawsuit is interested in media attention rather than the truth, as is obvious from his constant press appearances and 1-800 number. As we've said before, Mr. Combs cannot respond to every new publicity stunt, even in response to claims that are facially ridiculous or demonstratively false." Back to Ariel Mitchell-Kidd, she has represented different clients in this flurry of civil actions being filed against Sean Combs since his homes were first raided back in March. And there first started to be whispers about a federal investigation when that happened. Now, one of her most recent clients is a California Jane Doe who says that she was assaulted by Combs in 2018, but was able to escape and run to a neighbor for help. She also reportedly filed a police report, but says nothing really ever came of it. Anjanette Levy, host of Law&Crime's Crime Fix podcast, actually spoke with Mitchell-Kidd just a few weeks ago to learn more about her client, the allegations that she's making, and any proof of corroboration she might have. And according to Mitchell-Kidd, this Jane Doe brought up a woman named Christina Coram. Now, if you've been following this Sean Combs story, you're going to recognize that name because she is the woman who has been accused in at least one lawsuit of acting as Combs' right-hand woman, making sure that he had everything that he wanted, whenever he wanted it, including commercial sex workers. And she has been compared to Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's infamous madam. But to be clear, there's been no criminal charges filed against Christina Coram, and she has not been mentioned in any of the government's filings in this criminal case. But here is what Ariel Mitchell-Kidd had to say about her client's apparent connection to Christina Coram in her interview with Anjanette.
She actually also identified Christina Coram, who Mr. Combs has called KK, and has talked about her in several interviews. And when he received the BET Award, where he talked about, thanks, shout out to Cassie for holding me in the dark times, he actually started off with KK. And she said, "I never knew who that lady was. She was with him that night. It wasn't until recently, when the pictures have been coming across all over the internet of her, that she said, this is the lady who was there that night. It was a lady who I described to the police, who I did not identify or have a name, but that the Christina Coram lady was the one who had started to make jokes about sex trafficking my client, that she would be very good on the open market kind of thing. She said that kind of made her feel uncomfortable. And then she got a drink and then started to feel woozy. And then Mr. Combs first sexually assaulted her with an inanimate object, and then directed another gentleman who was there to then penetrate her while he was in the corner pleasuring himself, while Mr. Combs was in the corner pleasuring himself.
So this almost sounds like what's been alleged in these freak-off situations.
Absolutely. It was, and I've talked to several other individuals who I have not taken on as clients. I do not take on everyone who contacts me as a client. There's a level of due diligence that I do conduct and a level of evidence that I need to see in order to make a good faith basis to file a complaint. I do have obligations as an attorney and the bar ethically, and I also have my own moral obligations. So when we come and talk about things of this nature, I always have to use some type of corroborating evidence, either from individuals as witnesses, pictures, something to corroborate that this actually occurred. So I've had other individuals call me and tell me very similar stories, but unfortunately those individuals were not American citizens. They were foreign nationals who were trafficked into Miami by Mr. Combs. But because I could not verify their story, I was unable to take them on as clients.
Now, that was an anonymous female victim that she spoke about with Anjanette, while she told NBC News that it's one of her male clients who is set to testify in front of this grand jury. Now, there is something that we can say almost with a certainty, that if there is a superseding indictment, that is going to affect the trial date, right? May 5th, 2025, the current scheduled trial date. New charges could mean new evidence to look at, new discovery to go through, new witnesses to find and interview, new experts to find. Depending on the charges, defenses could change too. It's a lot to go through. It's a lot that could change. So it seems to me if that he really is subject to a superseding indictment, that trial date will be pushed off. Now, throughout all of this, Combs has staunchly maintained his innocence. And to be clear, he has not been found criminally responsible. He's not been found guilty. He has not been found civilly liable for any sort of sexual misconduct or sex crime. His legal team says they are looking forward to making their case in court, and they have said that Combs himself is likely to take the stand in his own defense and tell his side of the story. Well, we'll talk about that. Okay, so with all that in mind, I want to talk about these latest developments, and I want to bring in Professor Marian Bracha, who is a professor of law at Temple University. Professor, so good to have you. Thanks for coming here on Sidebar.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So what do you think is happening here? Do you think that a superseding indictment is a realistic possibility?
I think it's always a realistic possibility, especially if there are new witnesses, additional witnesses being brought before the grand jury. There's always the allowance for the government to bring a superseding indictment, to add, as you've mentioned, to add charges or to upgrade the already existing charges that have been filed. Of course, we won't know until the grand jury report or any indictment has been issued to know who testified and what the substance of their testimony was. But is it a possibility? It's always a possibility.
Would we necessarily know who testified? Would we know the identity of the people who testified?
I think it depends. I think if the grand jury report or the indictment named a complainant or a complaining witness, or what we colloquially refer to as the victim, then yes, we would know. If it was someone who was a minor at the time of the offenses, then probably not. Ordinarily, minors are referred to by their initials or by a pseudonym. But when and if that person ever came to trial to testify in open proceedings, then of course their identity would be known because they would be sworn in and identified in front of the jury.
I am curious about what potential new charges there could be, or upgrading or revising certain charges. We'll get to that in a second, but I think the timing is interesting, because do you think the prosecution learned about this, what could essentially be new evidence, before these new lawsuits were filed? Did they always know about it and wait to bring it to a grand jury? Why wasn't it brought originally? Remember, he's facing 3 charges. There was a question, could he be facing more? The timing of it, I think, is interesting.
The timing is interesting. I don't want to go so far as to speculate, because obviously we don't know what the ins and outs of the investigation are. We don't know what kind of or how frequent contacts the federal prosecutors from SDNY are in with the litigators and the attorneys that are handling the case on the civil side. But I don't think it's an unusual practice for criminal investigations to be informed by, sometimes even augmented by, civil litigation and the civil discovery practice. I don't think there's anything inappropriate or unethical about that. Those revelations from the discovery process on the civil side can help inform or help guide a criminal investigation or a decision on the prosecution side as to how to proceed or whether to proceed with the prosecution. So it might be a chicken and egg argument. It might be that the civil investigation started first and then was referred to the federal prosecutors or helped inform the federal prosecutors' decision making, or the other way around. It very well could be that the complainants or the would-be plaintiffs on the civil side weren't quite ready to cooperate with the prosecution or to testify before a grand jury, and felt more at ease with pursuing a civil remedy first. So we really can't know until the investigation is revealed.
And look, it makes sense, right? Why do we have charges against Sean Combs? Because of the civil lawsuits. I mean, it seems very clear that Cassandra Ventura is, if not one witness, the star witness for the prosecution's case. You read the indictment, it seems her allegations make up a large part of that. So again, I think this is a fair example of civil lawsuits that actually might have sparked a criminal investigation and criminal charges. Call me skeptical, call me, I don't know what you want to call me, but I wonder, tell me if I'm totally off here. What else is happening right now? The idea that Sean Combs is actively fighting his bail. He is trying to make bail. He is trying to fight pretrial detention. And I've done other sidebars on this before, Professor, where I actually think he's made some really good arguments to suggest that he does deserve to be released. He's put forward an attractive bail package. He's countered a lot of the prosecution's arguments. He cited Mike Jeffries, who is the former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, who was charged with sex trafficking crimes in New York. He gets bail. I don't have to reiterate a lot of the arguments, but I wonder if there is a motive for the prosecutors to say, hey, let's go forward. Let's get a superseding indictment so that we can really ensure that he is not, he doesn't make pretrial release. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, again, it might be part of their strategy. I would say this though, that bail is the purpose of bail is to ensure a defendant's presence at a proceeding. It's to make sure that if there is any inclination to flee or to absent oneself from the proceedings, that they have some stake in actually appearing and participating in the prosecution or participating in the hearing.
But now let's talk about the latest. We have a couple of filings we want to talk about. And first up, the government filed something called Opposition to the Defendant's Motions for a Hearing, Bill of Particulars, and Gag Order. A lot of legalese. I'm going to break it down. So they are addressing a few things here. First, they're asking the court to deny Combs' request for the court to hold an evidentiary hearing regarding alleged leaks made by the government. Now, we've discussed this before, but Combs' team has asserted that Homeland Security agents, the ones that raided his properties back in March, that they were the ones who leaked that infamous 2016 videotape of him purportedly beating Cassandra Ventura, his ex-girlfriend, in a hotel hallway. Remember, this was published by CNN. The government says, wait, there is no leak of any grand jury material here, which would be illegal under the law. All of this, really what the defense is doing, Judge, all of this is just an effort to suppress what would be a key piece of evidence in Combs' trial. Because after all, if the government really did improperly leak this video, it could arguably be prevented from coming into trial. But the government says, quote, but as the defendant is fully aware, the video was not in the government's possession at the time of CNN's publication, and the government has never at any point obtained the video through grand jury process. They also say the defendant baselessly accuses DHS agents who have no authority to issue grand jury process of secretly obtaining the intercontinental video unbeknownst to the prosecutors conducting the investigation and then leaking it to CNN. No evidentiary hearing is necessary to reject these assertions as incredible. Prosecutors also say the government ultimately obtained the intercontinental video at the same time as the general public on May 17, 2024, when CNN publicly released the footage. The morning that CNN released the intercontinental video, counsel for the defendant contacted the prosecutors assigned to the case to alert them that CNN had the video and expressed a concern that someone provided this footage to CNN. But here's the thing. Prosecutors said, you know what? We don't have the original copy of this video. We never got it. We tried to look for it. We tried to find it. We knew about it before it was published, meaning they knew it existed somewhere, but all they knew was that it had disappeared from the hotel server. And of course, there were allegations that Combs was instrumental in making this video disappear, even allegedly trying to bribe a security guard. So the government is like, this was never grand jury material. They even told Combs' lawyers in an email that they didn't have the video before CNN published it. In fact, in an email from prosecutor Emily Johnson to Sean Combs' defense team, which is attached to this filing, it says, to be clear, to our understanding, DHS did not have possession of the videotape prior to CNN's publication of it. The prosecutors also write that it strains credulity to suggest that law enforcement agents independently obtained the intercontinental video with a grand jury subpoena they have no authority to issue. The defendant refuses to acknowledge that multiple individuals other than government agents, including some of his own employees, may have had access to the intercontinental video. So that's something we've always wondered. I mean, how did CNN get it? Who leaked it to them? Where did it come from exactly? Was it somebody from Sean Combs' camp? Maybe. And they also explain how, yes, look, of course, there is a need for secrecy of the grand jury process. That's clear, right? Because if you don't have secrecy with the grand jury process, then witnesses may not testify, or it may affect their testimony if it's all out in the open, or the target of an investigation may flee if they know a grand jury is looking into them. But despite all that, the government says the federal rules regarding what can and can't be disclosed about the grand jury, it doesn't apply to information that's obtained independently outside of the grand jury process. In other words, this tape wasn't grand jury material. It wasn't non-public information that the government had in its possession. So that's all issue one as to why the prosecutors say Sean Combs is not entitled to an evidentiary hearing looking into alleged misconduct by the government. This is issue two. They say, quote, the defendant also complains about purported law enforcement sources leaking other alleged grand jury material to the media in several news articles cited in his papers and set forth in the attached table. This is where Combs' attorneys have made the argument, the allegation, that the government is improperly saying things to the media. For example, Combs' lawyers had cited a Deadline.com article that was reported on October 15th, 2024, and in that article, that a, quote, law enforcement source with knowledge of the case stated how all the defense was doing was shaming the alleged victims. It's part of the defense-offense course of action, and they'll try anything. So prosecutors responded here, and they say, the defendant is grasping at straws. Because the defendant cannot show that the information in the cited articles is grand jury material, and because he cannot show that government agents with access to grand jury material leaked the information, he can't make the prima facie showing required for the relief he seeks. And the reason for that is because prosecutors say that these comments to the media and these articles, it's all about the searches from Combs' property and what was recovered by law enforcement. And by law, that's not secret. That's not protected grand jury material that can't be disclosed. Information that's obtained by search warrants is not covered by the grand jury secrecy rule. And the same thing applies to information that's collected via wiretaps or witness interviews. The government also says, quote, moreover, none of the cited articles indicate on their face that any leaked information came from government attorneys or members of the prosecution team. Even the articles that attribute information to law enforcement do so vaguely, citing law enforcement sources or sources familiar with the investigation. To meet the burden, a far more explicit connection between the alleged leak and the law enforcement officers conducting the investigation is required. So that's all the reasons why they're saying, court, don't grant Sean Combs an evidentiary hearing. There's nothing to be decided here. Okay, this is another point that the prosecutors want to address. They are saying that Sean Combs is also not entitled to what is called a bill of particulars in this case. So a bill of particulars is when a defendant says to the government, I need some more. I need some more clarity on my charges. You need to itemize it out for me. I need more details on each charge so I can properly understand the case, so I can properly defend myself. And it's a way for a defendant to avoid being surprised at trial. Prosecutors here are like, no, not so fast. You don't need this. It's unnecessary. And you know what? It's improper. They write, quote, as an initial matter, the defendant has been more than sufficiently apprised of the charges he faces, including through a 14-page speaking indictment, the government's submissions, and statements on the record in connection with the defendant's bail hearings and significant productions of discovery. And at the appropriate times, in accordance with the well-established practices in this district, the defendant will receive even more disclosures about the conduct with which he is charged, including through additional discovery, an enterprise letter, a witness and exhibit list. Accordingly, the defendant cannot credibly claim that he will suffer unfair surprise at trial. Rather, it is plain that the defendant's request for a bill of particulars containing victims' names is merely a vehicle to attempt to prematurely restrict the government's proof at trial and use these criminal proceedings to defend himself in the press against complaints in separate civil litigation. This improper request should be denied in its entirety. So that's a big statement to make. And what they're basically saying is, Sean Combs, look, we have been clear about your charges, but you know what? You will get more evidence in time about your crimes. And you can't just request this to help you defend yourself in the myriad of civil lawsuits that you currently face, suggesting that there's an overlap between the criminal case and the civil actions. And the prosecution's like, look, also with a bill of particulars, you got to be careful because you can't use it to limit the prosecution's case. Oh, we're only going to limit the government's case to this specific proof. If that's what happens, that would restrict the prosecutor's ability to present its case at trial to what's only in this bill of particulars. And there's a lot of evidence here. This is a constantly evolving investigation. They say this is not right. And also they make the point about identifying victims because obviously Sean Combs wants to know who his accusers are after all. And to be clear, no victims or even witnesses are identified by name in the indictment or any of the government's papers. But the government has a response to that. Hey, we need the bill of particulars to ID the victims. They write, the defendants claim that there is no way for Mr. Combs to determine who the other unidentified alleged victims are rings hollow. The indictment, along with other disclosures, including discovery, adequately advises the defendant of the criminal acts of which he is accused and accordingly of potential victims. To the contrary, the victims are individuals whom the defendant is alleged to have trafficked, violently assaulted, and transported across state lines for commercial sex, among other criminal acts in which the defendant directly participated. So in other words, you should know who these people are. Now, there's one other thing I have to add here. The government, in this filing, they reveal not only what evidence they have in their possession, but what they've turned over to the defense. And this is significant. They write, the government has made 3 significant productions of discovery material, which include the following categories of materials: all search warrants and supporting affidavits, hotel financial and communication records produced pursuant to grand jury subpoenas, and electronically stored information from over 60 of the defendant's own devices and iCloud accounts, including, among other things, text messages, audio and video recordings, photographs, and documents which the defendant had requested be prioritized. These materials contain additional details about the allegations against the defendant, including, for example, specific allegations relating to multiple victims in search warrant affidavits and communications with victims and witnesses from the defendant's devices. So that makes me wonder if that ties back to the allegation that he had been improperly contacting witnesses, and one of the reasons why he's been denied bail. So again, that could be really, really key evidence that has been turned over to the defense. But in other words, big picture here, they're saying, Combs, you should have an idea of what's happening here. You know who these people are. Now, continuing on with the government, they say, look, defense, don't worry. We aren't going to surprise you. We're not going to surprise you at trial. We will give you 15 days notice prior to trial of any witness or any evidence that we're going to introduce. And I've said this before, when it comes to federal cases, it's not as transparent at state cases. And look, providing information 15 days before trial, we might not know who the victims or the witnesses are until much later in this investigation, much later in this case. So with a May 2025 trial date, we might not know things till closer to. But prosecutors say there's another danger here too, that we don't want to readily disclose the names of these victims because Combs, he has been accused of a wide-ranging set of violent acts and threats and obstruction as part of this racketeering case, and there are serious allegations that Combs engaged in witness tampering, implying that there could be a risk to the victim's safety and ability of witnesses to testify if their names are revealed to Sean Combs. By the way, I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to talk about something else in a little bit. Finally, there's one more issue that the government addresses in this filing that we need to talk about, and that concerns Combs' attempt to basically, essentially, stop accusers from speaking to the media about their claims. And there have been many public comments made about the lawsuits and so forth, but the government says what Combs is doing is underhanded. Quote, by providing potential witnesses in the criminal case and their counsel for making extrajudicial statements, the defendant is essentially asking for either a blanket order that would apply indiscriminately to any individuals with claims against Combs and their lawyers, or for a more limited order that would require the government to identify its witnesses 6 months before trial. Not only would such relief be unprecedented, but the defendant should not be permitted to use a local criminal rule as a sword to gag civil claimants whether or not their statements were connected to this criminal proceeding or to evade established case law in this circuit. So in other words, this is an underhanded attempt to try to identify these people once again, and they are saying that Combs' gag motion on the victims, that should be denied. By the way, one more thing I have to call out about this filing, because at one point in this filing, the prosecutors reveal when they started looking into Sean Combs. Quote, in or around November 2023, and as described in more detail below, federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, working with case agents from the Human Trafficking Squad of the New York Field Office of Homeland Security Investigations, began investigating Combs and others for violations of federal criminal law. That is so significant because we always believed it was the lawsuits that were filed against Sean Combs, specifically the one from Cassandra Ventura that was filed in November of 2023, that started this criminal investigation. So a statement like that sure looks like it was the lawsuits that started the criminal investigation. Okay, now, another thing I need to mention was that the day after this brief was filed, the judge overseeing this criminal case, Judge Arun Subramanian, said that the court had received a letter from prosecutors too, and it was a letter supporting what they just laid out, everything that I just mentioned. But prosecutors had asked the court to seal the letter so no one can see it. So perhaps there was some sensitive information in there? We don't know, but it's notable that prosecutors had asked for that. But that is not all we have to talk about, because we have to talk about Sean Combs having a right to face his accusers. Moreover, more specifically, I should say, to the civil context, because Combs got a win this week in one of the cases filed by Texas attorney Tony Buzbee. Remember him? He's the attorney who has vowed to file over 100 lawsuits against Sean Combs from all of these accusers. He's already filed multiple lawsuits in the last few weeks. And one of those lawsuits is from an unidentified woman who filed a lawsuit against Combs in New York federal court, and she alleged that Combs raped her and threatened her life in 2004 when she was just 19 years old. The issue, though, is that she filed this lawsuit under a pseudonym, Jane Doe, which, by the way, a lot of Combs' accusers have done recently. But Judge Mary K. Weiskosel issued an order saying, nope, she can't do this. She can't continue to proceed with this case under a pseudonym. I'm going to break it down why. So under the federal rules, a person filing a lawsuit has to actually name all the parties. And look, the public has a right to know who is using their courts for initiating legal actions. This is actually backed by the First Amendment. And really, the only time a plaintiff can refrain from being named is if there is a substantial privacy concern that outweighs everything else. And here the court says the plaintiff fails in showing that. First, the court says that while sexual assault allegations are highly sensitive and personal, that in and of itself is not enough. As to the argument, well, we can't reveal Jane Doe's identity because that will risk her safety, the court was unpersuaded because they say she didn't provide any support of how her safety would be in jeopardy other than her claiming that 20 years ago, Sean Combs threatened her life if she ran away. The thing is, he hasn't contacted her in 20 years. And the court says Jane Doe claiming she will suffer mental harm if her identity is revealed. The problem with that is public humiliation is not enough. The court says you can't just make a blanket argument that revealing your identity would further victimize you, because then every sexual assault accuser would have to proceed anonymously, which is not what the law allows. And by the way, other people have sued Sean Combs and have identified themselves, and their allegations are heinous and sensitive and embarrassing and subject themselves to scrutiny. So Jane Doe, you can be really no different unless you show more. And the court's saying, Jane Doe, if you want to proceed anonymously, you need to show evidence of the harm that you would suffer, like a statement from a mental health professional, or maybe a sworn affidavit from Jane Doe. And the court makes a good point too here, because they say, you brought this lawsuit. This was your decision. You know that you are putting your credibility at risk. This was your choice. Sean Combs has a right to investigate his accuser, to challenge her allegations, to challenge her credibility. Sean Combs needs to know who this is. And they explain later on in the brief, you're also talking about alleged misconduct from 20 years ago, which is difficult to defend even if you knew who the plaintiff was. But to not know who she is, you're making the defense's case a lot more difficult when it shouldn't be. We want to talk about the Metropolitan Detention Center, to be exact. You see, it's being reported that investigators from the Bureau of Prisons, the DOJ's Inspector General's office, and other agencies have launched a, quote, interagency operation at the MDC. Why? What are they looking into? Why now, right? Especially now that Sean Combs is being detained there. And that part's not entirely clear, right? We don't really know whether it has anything to do with Sean Combs or other specific inmates or detainees. What I will say is that there was this joint statement that was released, and it says that this operation was, quote, designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. Now, the Bureau of Prisons has said that this operation was already planned and that there's, quote, no active threat, and they also said that they wouldn't reveal too much information at this point. Quote, in an effort to maintain the safety and security of all personnel inside the facility and the integrity of this operation. That's why they're not going to reveal more information. Now, I will say, reporting indicates that perhaps authorities may be doing a surprise, widespread search of contraband at the facility, although we can't confirm if that's the exact reason. But there are a few things to note here when we talk about the MDC. The MDC, which houses approximately 1,200 people, mostly those who are arrested and those who are awaiting trial, as well as those serving short sentences, this is a facility that has been plagued with issues: violence, deplorable conditions, not enough manpower, drug smuggling. In fact, earlier this year, New York Representative Dan Goldman stated he would file a formal request for an investigation into the MDC. He released a statement saying, quote, over the last 2 years, there have been steady reports of deteriorating conditions at MDC harming inmates and correctional officers alike, including chronic understaffing, perpetual solitary confinement, and widespread violence. And then he said how a federal judge earlier this year cited the prison system's dreadful conditions as a reason not to remand a defendant to MDC. He said, quote, earlier this year, I toured MDC with the warden and executives from the Bureau of Prisons, all of whom acknowledged the improvements needed at the facility. Unfortunately, conditions have only gotten worse. And Representative Goldman also cited the death of at least 4 inmates in the period of 7 months, and even highlighted the death of Edwin Corrodero, who was a 36-year-old inmate who died in a fight at the MDC. The feds actually ended up charging multiple inmates last month in connection with a series of attacks at this federal lockup, including one incident of a stabbing with an ice pick and also an attack on a corrections officer. By the way, speaking corrections officers, we have another former CO who actually pled guilty to smuggling cell phone chargers into the MDC. And by the way, recently, another inmate was charged in a murder plot to kill a rival on the outside. But in the end, all that happened was an innocent bystander was shot, a 28-year-old woman outside of a nightclub. Apparently, the inmate used a contraband cell phone to plan this failed attack. In terms of the conditions, give you another update, inmates, they won a $10 million settlement over freezing during a blackout that lasted over a week back in 2019. So you're getting a sense of what's happening at the MDC, right? Now, when it comes to Sean Combs, who has been denied bail twice so far, even though he's actively fighting it, we believe, based on reporting, that he's being housed in the MDC's special housing unit, which our understanding mostly consists of him sitting in his cell for 23 hours a day. This is due to safety concerns. In fact, here's his attorney, Mark Agnifilo, describing the conditions of the MDC.
Can you describe the conditions of the detention right now for him?
So the food is inedible, from what I've been told. It's way too hot in the summer. Sometimes there's no heat at all in the winter. The toilet water has been known to freeze. It's violent. Someone like Mr. Combs, might be a target for certain things.
Okay, so what's going on here? How could this affect Sean Combs? Does this investigation have anything to do with the high-profile nature of Sean Combs' case? Well, let me bring in prison consultant Justin Paperny to talk a little bit more about this. Justin, so good to see you. Thanks for coming on. Before we even get into this latest development about what this investigation could be, what do you know about the MDC?
I know for quite some time they've needed long-term change there. Safety issues around the prison, the contraband. There is a problem at the top with leadership. When you're in high metropolitan areas, it's tough to get people to want to work there. There's high turnover. So this leadership failure is putting prisoners in jeopardy. There's very little accountability. I will tell you, when you hear interagency operation, that tells me this is very, very serious. They've had enough. I think Diddy being in prison at this time, I think it just aligns with that's been going on for quite some time. I will say I think it's concerning that they're not going to share details of the investigation until it's complete. The biggest problem is the lack of transparency and accountability. And until that changes, it's going to be more of the same, more prisoners getting hurt, more safety issues, more settlements that taxpayers fund. The Bureau of Prisons needs more accountability. And until that happens, we're just going to continue to have these calls in the weeks, months, and years to come.
Well, the other way of looking at that is they want to be sensitive. They don't want to release too much information during the course of this investigation that could jeopardize whatever they're looking into. So imagine, for example, they really are doing a widespread sweep of contraband. I mentioned some of the incidents that are happening. If they, make that announcement or they kind of give more details, perhaps people could get rid of the evidence. Someone could help them. And you tell me if I'm looking at it the wrong way.
Sure. I think prudent transparency would be a good phrase, right? I know they're doing investigations. They might not want to divulge everything finding, but they could be updating stakeholders along the way. People are concerned about people are in prison. Their loved ones are concerned for them. They want to see some progress and growth. So I'm not suggesting they share everything that could threaten the security of the institution, which is really what any prison cares most about: security of the institution, keeping costs down. But if they care about keeping costs down, they're making decisions that only increase costs. So they should share some information prudently to at least appease people who have an interest in overseeing this process.
What do you think is going on here? Why do you think this investigation is about? Do you think it's about looking for contraband or something else?
I think certainly it's looking for contraband. They know when you have myriad agencies looking into this, there is a problem, and it's getting to a point where people have said enough. There's got to be effective leadership at the top. It needs to trickle down to staff. They may have to pay correctional officers more money. It's tough to get people to work in these communities, as I have said. So they're at a point where they have said this is a national embarrassment. It's something that both Democrats and Republicans agree on, which is pretty damn uncommon in this environment. So they're at a point where they say we want transparency, we want long-term change, we want accountability for staff, which is something that's been lacking over a sustained period of time. So I think they view this as an opportunity, but they tend to lack transparency in the process. I would argue the more they give, the more trust they're actually going to receive. And if they acknowledge failings along the way, people are then going to say they're beginning to get it. They're not hiding. They're sharing. Only then can you have improvement. But it's difficult for anyone, including a massive bureaucratic agency, to say, we've made mistakes. Here's how we're going to do better. There tends to be too much blaming and excusing, not enough accountability.
To give you an idea of that, I mean, the Bureau of Prisons announced last month that it was going to increase staffing at the MDC by about 20%. But it's our understanding there's still a lot of positions left open, which is a scary thing to think about in terms of a facility that houses that many detainees. I guess the question is, when we're thinking about this, and we'll talk about Combs in a second, but when we're thinking about the MDC, are the issues that are plaguing this facility just individual to this facility, or is this typical of federal lockups, other state lockups? Is the MDC an outlier? What can you tell us?
It's very common across the country. There are certain areas where it's just more expensive to live. New York could be a more expensive area to live. I know the federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon. Oregon can be an expensive place to live. They've had trouble staffing that prison because if you're making $60,000, $80,000 a year, I'm not saying it's not a lot of money. What I'm saying is that you can't sustain yourself living in that town. So the consequence is they don't have enough staff. There's not enough programs for the prisoners. Certain programs like the residential drug abuse program in the federal system that could take a year off of your system, a year off your sentence upon completion, can no longer be run in that prison because there's not enough staff. Well, what does that mean? In California, for example, there isn't one camp or prison that offers the drug program. If you want to go to Oregon, you may have to go to Minnesota, Yankton, because of staff shortages. So they need to train better, they need to pay better, and they need to find a way to somehow retain the talent. And until they have, it's just going to be this revolving door. And that's part of the reason they're going through this massive investigation. And they're finally asking good questions. What can we do to keep people on our team for longer periods of time, protect prisoners, and have more accountability for staff? It's reached a point where people have simply had enough.
Do you think that has anything to do with Sean Combs? Do you think it took a high-profile celebrity to be housed there? And remember, there's R. Kelly who was there. Sam Bankman-Fried is he's serving a sentence there. But let me ask you a question. Do you think it takes somebody like a Sean Combs who's there to bring attention to this? Do you think he's a factor in why this investigation is being launched?
I don't. I think it's been going on since Epstein hung himself in that adjacent prison. They knew that it was a problem boiling up for quite some time. And then with the publicity that came with Epstein, they had said we'd had enough. But when you're dealing with
and just to be clear about that was the MCC. It closed in 2021. But
correct. It's an adjacent prison, but still, we're dealing with problems in these prison systems in New York. And I just think it got to a point where they said there's too much attention on us. We just can't turn away from this any longer. And when you're dealing with the BOP, it's like the DMV times 100 with the bureaucracy, right? It takes so long to get these investigations going. And now that when you have several agencies involved in this operation, imagine the coordination of getting all these people together. This has been going on for weeks, months, and years. I just hope, as I said earlier, there's some prudent transparency and they're sharing progress, both good and bad. I would argue the more bad they share, the more they share what they could have done better and what they are learning, the more trust they're going to get from stakeholders like politicians. Until they do that, it's going to continue and say anything and threaten security of the institution. It's the same old playbook that doesn't work, and it's part of the reason there's such loathing from the left and right on how the BOP manages these issues.
The reason I asked is because his lawyers, his lawyer Mark Agnifilo was quite vocal about the problems in that jail. Having said that, Combs at one point, his legal team was actually trying to transfer him to a jail in New Jersey. They seem to have abandoned that. I think they said at the time that the MDC was responsive to them. Not exactly sure what that meant. But now, look, Combs is trying to fight bail again. He's trying to ask the current judge, the new judge who's overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian, to grant him bail. So this is a third judge that would consider it. Do you think that this investigation and these issues plaguing the MDC would work in his favor to get him bail or pretrial release?
I don't. There are people in that prison who aren't getting bail for charges that are far less severe than his. And one thing the Bureau of Prisons want to do is treat him differently based on his status. If anything, you could argue they're going to make it harder. I empathize with his lawyer. He's saying what he's paid to say, but his client has to own and acknowledge his own conduct, not just the alleged crime, his post-offense conduct where the government felt he is a threat unity. And for that reason, I expect him, regardless of who the judge is, to continue to be confined. And until he begins making different decisions, perhaps accepting responsibility, cooperating. I filmed a YouTube video where I said yesterday he should agree to turn over every dollar he has to victims and victims' rights groups. It's the only way he doesn't serve 50 or 60 years in prison. Maybe it's how he gets 15 or 20. The onus is on him to make better decisions. Until then, you can expect his lawyer to continue to say what lawyers are paid to say. My guy should be free. It doesn't work not in this environment.
Well, the other way of looking at it is he is innocent until proven guilty. He hasn't been found liable in any of these lawsuits. He's denying all the allegations. I will ask you, though, when it comes to this, somebody this high profile, housed in an institution like this, his attorney alluded to the fact that he might be a target, talked about the violence in the MDC. How much of it is a concern if you're Sean Combs being in this facility, that your life might be in danger?
It's certainly a concern. There are people in prison who have been there for a very long time, who may feel forgotten, could care less if they're in prison for the rest of their life, if they go to a higher security prison, if they get transferred to go to the hole. So there is no doubt there is concern for his safety. And his health, which is part of the reason he remains confined. Though I will tell you, there's a lot of high-profile people in prison. We're looking at the Menendez guys getting out of prison potentially after 36 years. They've gotten through it. There are high-profile people who have been able to get through it. The downside for Combs is it's just more scrutiny. It's more time in isolation. It's a harder experience. But there's no doubt there's risks for his life there. And if he gets to the general population, he's really going to have to understand his environment. And he's going to have to understand how people are studying him and watching him. It requires humility in how he responds. I know if he pleads guilty or is convicted and gets sentenced, we'll eventually talk about his life in that general population or how to even get through a very lengthy federal prison sentence. But to your question, there is no question. There's risk for his health, and he thinks about it, and so does his family, 24 hours a day.
What do you think the result of this investigation is going to be? How much will we know what happens? Because I will say, Representative Goldman, who I mentioned before, he talked about how he co-sponsored the Federal Prison Oversight Act, which my understanding requires the DOJ's Inspector General's office to conduct vigorous oversight of the federal prison system. I wonder if what we're seeing now is part of that. But what do you imagine is going to result from this interagency investigation?
It's hard for people to see it, especially if their loved one has just come into the system. But change, it is getting better. Colette Peters has been an excellent director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. She says we want to make good neighbors, not good inmates. But you have to understand this massive bureaucracy change takes time. So because I've been to prison and I've been in this space full time for the last 15 years, my business partner served 26 years in prison. He went to the penitentiary in 1987. It was measurably worse then. So we are seeing change. It's getting better. Unfortunately, it's not as fast as people would like, but I expect there to be more transparency, more accountability, more acknowledgments of failures. I think she's been a very good leader for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There's been transition and turnover. I expect her to stay there for quite some time. I expect to see more progress and, more importantly, accountability and transparency. And it all starts with saying we've made mistakes. They need to do what they expect people who are indicted of crimes to do, right? I get indicted for a crime. We want you to accept responsibility. We want you to say that you're going to do better. You're going to hold yourself accountable. You're going to prove worthy of a second chance. We want the Bureau to do the same exact thing for mistakes they have made.
Justin Paperny, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.